Christopher Regan est professeur d'économie à l'Université McGill depuis 1989. Son CV aussi est assez étoffé. Je vais essayer de faire un tour succinct. Chercheur émérite au C.D. Howe Institute, il a dirigé la chaire de politique monétaire David Dodge de 2010 à 2013, en plus d'avoir été membre de son conseil de la politique monétaire durant plusieurs années. De janvier 2009 à juin 2010, il a été économiste invité Clifford Clark au ministère des Finances à Ottawa, où il a exercé les fonctions de conseiller senior auprès du ministre et d'autres hauts fonctionnaires. En 2004 et 2005, il a agi à titre de conseiller spécial auprès du gouverneur de la Banque du Canada et depuis 2014, M. Regan préside la commission co-fiscale du Canada. Cette commission a lancé en novembre 2014 un groupe indépendant de 12 économistes déterminés à promouvoir des changements fiscaux qui seront bénéfiques à la fois pour l'économie et pour l'environnement. M. Regan a eu l'idée de la création de cette commission et y agit à titre de président. La mission de cette commission est de proposer et promouvoir des solutions fiscales concrètes pour le Canada pour stimuler l'innovation nécessaire à une plus grande prospérité économique et environnementale. Quelques exemples de solutions fiscales ayant fait leur preuve à travers le monde sont, premièrement, la tarification de l'eau à Singapour, dont le prix de l'utilisation a été établi en fonction des coûts de traitement et d'approvisionnement. Deuxièmement, la réduction par 36% en 10 ans de l'achalandage dans une zone de congestion intense à Londres suite à l'imposition d'un péage routier dans l'une des zones les plus achalandées de la ville. Et troisièmement, la tarification des déchets solides au Royaume-Uni qui a permis de réduire de plus de 40% en 5 ans l'enfouissement de déchets industriels et commerciaux. Il me fait donc un énorme plaisir de vous présenter notre deuxième conférencier, M. Christopher Regan.
Merci. Merci Sébastien. Et merci pour l'invitation. Merci Sébastien et Clément et Asdec. C'est toujours bon d'être à Québec. I don't get here enough. Malheureusement, je suis arrivé juste avant le dîner et je dois partir juste après la première bière. Catastrophe. Comme Sébastien a dit, aujourd'hui, je voudrais parler d'une nouvelle commission qui est établie pour trouver des solutions pratiques à un problème très important, mais un problème qui n'est pas nouveau. Je pense que c'est déjà très évident que je ne suis pas encore bilingue et c'est la raison pour laquelle je pense que je devrais vous parler aujourd'hui en anglais. So I will. So I'd like to talk about this thing, Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission, la Commission de l'éco-fiscalité du Canada. What is it, what it's all about, where it came from. I should begin by saying that I am a fish out of water when I talk about the issues in this commission. Like Sebastian said, I am a macroeconomist. I've spent 25 years at McGill. I just got my 25-year pin. And I've spent almost all of those 25 years thinking about monetary policy. And if I wasn't thinking about monetary policy, I was still thinking about macro policy. Budget deficits, exchange rates, mostly really monetary policy. And so it's unusual to be, this is a bit of a life changer for me. I'm still talking about macro issues, but I'm talking about tax issues more than I ever was before, and talking about environmental issues. So I'd like to just talk about where this all came from. Clément and I met on January 5th, 2009, when we both arrived the same day at the Ministry of Finance in Ottawa. I was there as the Clifford Clark economist, and he was just there as a financial market smart guy. And we shared an unusual experience there, trying to learn what acronyms were in Ottawa. We came out of our first meeting on the first day, and we didn't understand 30% of what was said. And then the deputy's executive assistant came up to us. She saw the astounded look on our face. And she gave us a printed sheet with 100 acronyms, mostly three-letter acronyms, commonly used in the Ministry of Finance and in Ottawa. And I pinned that up on my wall, and Clément pinned that up on his wall, and then we understood what was going on in the Department of Finance. But it was when I was in the Department of Finance, after Clément left and he answered the call from Jean Charest and entered Quebec politics, and I was sorry to see him go, but pleased to see him enter Quebec politics, that I got into something that got me along this road. So here is the genesis of what the Eco-Fiscal Commission is all about. Over the last few years, I have been thinking about a debate that exists in the literature between green growth and degrowth. So green growth is reasonably self-explanatory, I think. The idea that you can have economic growth but do it in a way that is environmentally sensible. The degrowth literature is quite an extreme literature, although it is becoming more and more mainstream. But the degrowth literature is a group of people who actually argue that we don't need growth. We should actually be reducing GDP growth and maybe even reducing the level of GDP because of environmental problems, because of resource scarcity, because of inequality problems. A lot of these issues get into that argument. So I was thinking about green growth versus degrowth, and I'm not a degrowther, I'm much more of a green growther. Also thinking about the debate that gets very polarized in the press between the change everything people and the do-nothing people. So there are people like Naomi Klein is actually a very well-known change everything person. So confronted with the problems of population growth or climate change or other related problems, there's a tendency to suggest that we need to completely change the system. Typically there's not a positive alternative put forward. But it is we need to completely, throw everything out the window and start over. There's also the do-nothing crowd, which is the, technology will solve our problems, we don't need to worry about it, and we can just sit around and coast. And I tend to be a fairly moderate person, so I don't see the change everything as being at all sensible, but nor do I see the do-nothing crowd as being sensible. And for many years I've had policy interests. I'm very much a policy-interested macroeconomist, and my time at the Department of Finance and also at the Bank of Canada sharpened those interests. They were life-changing experiences for me in terms of learning how policy really happens. But I also learned about a policy disconnect. You think about the way policy-interested academic economists think and the way that economists in a place like the Department of Finance think, and I'm sure it would be the same whether it's Quebec City or Queen's Park or Victoria, that there is this disconnect between the way these two groups of people think. And the basic disconnect is that government economists very quickly get into the weeds, the details, because they need to deal with the details. But because they get so far into the weeds, they tend to lose sight of important large principles. And academic economists start from the large principles, and we typically do not have access to the information that gets us into the weeds. So we as academics tend to be up talking about principles, and the governments tend to be thinking about what's going on in the weeds, and these two groups of people need each other desperately because the academics need to know about these details. But the people that are in the weeds need to not lose sight of the basic principles. And one of the beautiful things about the position I was in the Department of Finance and that Clément was in is that it brings together these sorts of, these two disparate groups. So that's where this all came from. And one of the things that I was working on in the Department of Finance was Canada's climate change policy. You may be excused for wondering whether there was one. But there was one. In 2009 and 2010, Environment Canada was working on the design of a cap-and-trade system. And my job, one of my jobs, was to figure out what Environment Canada was doing. Remember, I was at the Department of Finance. And there are silos in the federal government, as there are probably silos in most governments. And so my job in the Department of Finance was to find out maybe a little, sneaky move, infiltration, find out what Environment Canada was doing, and Finance's job generally is to say, no, that's not good enough, why don't you let us do it because we're smarter. That's basically Finance's approach, and which is often true. Anyway, so I found out over time, we found out what policy was being developed, and it was a pretty appalling policy, in my view. It was a high-cost policy. It was a cap-and-trade system. I don't have anything fundamentally against cap-and-trade systems, but this one was being designed rather poorly, I thought, and under unrealistic assumptions, and it was designed in a way that would explicitly not achieve the government's objectives. Other than that, it was fine. And so I went through what I like to call a policy depression, staring out the window one day thinking, geez, what do you have to do to get good policy around here? And my answer to that question was, well, suppose you got a bunch of smart people in a room and you locked them in the room for 5 years and you gave them food periodically and you asked them to come up with good ideas and then write it in sensible ways. Surely the world would listen. Well, that was my naive academic response to that question. But that's what we did, and that's what this is really all about. So the goal here is to get better economic performance and better environmental performance. And I'll talk a little bit about the obstacle to this goal, but that is the fundamental goal of the Eco-Fiscal Commission. Can we come up with ways that will improve our economy and improve our environment, and isn't it true that these two things go together? So that is the goal combined with a little bit of underlying belief. So let me just show you a little bit of data. I won't show you nearly as much as data as Robert showed you, but my fonts will generally be larger. Not always. So here is just a little evidence that we can do better. These are environmental performance indicators. And so what you see here, Canada is in red, and a bunch of other countries are in other colors. And I'll just do this very quickly. So this is an overall environmental performance index. So Canada is not the worst in this group, but we're certainly not the best. In resource productivity, we're very low. So we actually use, this is resources used per unit of GDP, okay? Or other way around, actually. It's GDP per unit of resource, and it's very low. So we're actually using a huge amount of resources to produce a unit of GDP. We are producing a large amount of CO2 emissions to produce a unit of GDP, and we are using a tremendous amount of water to produce a unit of GDP. So we're very low in all of these things, okay? Now those are just 4 particular measures of environmental performance. In our first report that was released when we launched in November, we talk about some others. Here are some quick and dirty measures of economic performance. So here is a global competitiveness index from the GCI. And this is a weighted average of a bunch of things that influence corporate competitiveness. And what you see is that Canada is lower than a bunch of these countries. We are not the lowest, but we're lower than a bunch. A sub-part of that competitiveness index is innovation. Canada is not doing too well by these comparator countries. And GDP per capita, we're somewhere in the middle. Now, take a look at what these countries are. They are kind of standard comparator countries for us. United States, UK, Germany, but also a couple of small resource-intensive countries, Australia and Norway. So we're doing that for a reason. And so what worries me about looking at GDP per capita and concluding that it's not bad is that GDP per capita over time is going to be driven by, among other things, our productivity growth and our innovation. So if we are quite low in these things, chances are we will not have a great future on this thing. Okay? So there's a belief that we can do better. Now, what's the big obstacle to our goal? Well, I think the big obstacle to our goal is a belief. And I think this belief is absolutely pervasive, and I think it's absolutely wrong, but it is nonetheless there. The belief is that we can only have a healthier environment if we are prepared to make an economic sacrifice. Protecting the environment has to cost us from the pocket, and therefore, and if that were true, you would therefore ask the question, is it worth it? I'm not at all convinced that that's true. So anybody who has read their history of Canada has read about the history of fish and beavers and wheat and lumber, and all of those things are coming from a healthy environment, different parts of a healthy environment. And if you wanted those things to be sustainable, and some of them haven't been particularly sustainable, this one hasn't been particularly sustained anyways. I think it was sustainable had we behaved differently. But most of those things they're coming from a clean environment, and the cleaner is that environment, the healthier those industries can be. I think there tends to be a focus on the short run versus the long run. So I think this idea that it will cost us money, cost us economic prosperity to have a healthier environment is a very short run view. So people would say, well, there's a beautiful tree. If we cut down the tree, we get GDP from it. But we cut down the tree, and so if we're going to save the tree, we have to not cut down the tree, and therefore there's a clear trade-off. And I think in the short run that's quite right. I think in the long run that's not right. I think the management of resources over the long run suggests that the cleaner is that environment, or at least to some point, the healthier those resource communities can be. And something that most people don't come close to recognizing is that Canadians are already paying significant economic costs out of pocket from environmental damage that's going on. And these things are often subtle. So here's just a few examples. This example is an estimate from the Canadian Medical Association. So their estimate is that if you look at just air pollution, okay, air pollution alone, so nothing about water pollution, nothing about climate change, nothing about other types of pollution, just air pollution, and you look at the costs to health that are coming out of our healthcare budgets, treating people, over 20 years, 2008 to 2031, the estimate was $230 billion. That's $10 billion a year. That's serious money. Okay? Now that is just the health costs of air pollution. It's not including the costs associated with cleaning up the air. It's not including the costs of the productivity loss, for example, if you get sick and stay home and you give up production and income. Those aren't in there. So that's just the direct health costs. $3 billion plus is the insurance cost in 2013 alone from severe or extreme weather events. So we now know, and in the last few years we've been hearing more from the insurance industry, and this is why the insurance industry is now getting so concerned about climate change, that their costs are going up significantly, and as a result property insurance premiums are going up. But that's a genuine cost. And climate risks in general are impacting all kinds of sectors of the economy in lots of fascinating, frankly, and subtle ways. So I think there's lots of costs that are going on from environmental damage today that are coming out of our pocket today that we simply do not recognize. And hopefully over time we will come to recognize, and that really does change this view about whether a healthy economy and a healthy environment can go together. So here's our policy solution. Notice I'm talking about a policy solution, not the policy solution, and I'll come back to that. So what the Eco-Fiscal Commission is all about is about re-engineering our fiscal structures. So a fiscal structure, as you know, is a set of policies that collect money for governments and a set of policies that spend that money by governments. You're collecting money on a bunch of different tax bases. You're spending it in a bunch of different ways. So that is, in broad terms, of course, what fiscal policy is about. But you know, as economists, that a dollar is not a dollar is not a dollar. It actually does matter tremendously how you raise your revenues because the way you design the tax system or the fiscal system influences incentives. If you're going to change incentives, you're going to change behavior, and if you're going to change behavior, you're going to change outcomes. So we all know that. We all probably have RRSPs. RRSPs are a classic example of where the fiscal structure has been tweaked in a particular way to change incentives. TFSAs, same thing. Investment tax credits, tuition fee. I mean, you know there are many kinds of tax credit policies that are designed, some of them are stupid, but many of them are designed sensibly to change incentives, to change behavior, and they do change behavior, and change outcomes. My least favorite policy from the 2009 budget, and Clément was there for it, was also the most popular, by far the most popular federal policy in the 2009 budget was the home renovation tax credit. The home renovation tax credit violated every principle of public finance I have ever learned. It was just a terribly designed, awful, inefficient, expensive, ugly policy. But man, did it work politically, right? It was politically, by far, the most popular policy. I'm glad to say that I helped, as part of a large team, to contribute to its demise in 2010. So incentives matter. Incentives are influenced by how you design the fiscal structure. And our fiscal structures have evolved in a very kind of bizarre way. We now, we do not tax things that we clearly recognize are bad, pollution of various kinds. So by not taxing them, we are, you might be a bit too strong to say that we're encouraging them, but we're certainly not discouraging them. But at the same time, we are taxing income, we are taxing profits, we are taxing employment. So we claim to like profits and income and employment. So we're generally taxing the things that we like, and we are not taxing the things that we clearly don't like. I've never met anybody in any political party who likes pollution. I've never met that person, and I don't think they exist. I don't think anybody likes pollution. Yet we have a tax system that certainly doesn't try to tax it. And if you think about how our tax system has evolved over time, from 100 years ago, when it was mostly customs duties, to then the introduction of income tax and the scaling down of customs duties and tariffs, and then a shift away from income taxes toward consumption taxes. And now we're ready, I think, for the next step. And the next step is to scale down further income taxes of various kinds and to scale up taxes on pollution. And I think 50 years from now we will look back and we'll see that happen over the next 20 years. And I'm talking about a policy solution, not the policy solution. So there's lots of debate among economists about whether getting the prices right through the tax system is necessary or whether it is sufficient. Okay? So some people say that if you actually design the fiscal structure sensibly, you will solve the problem, right? It'll change the relative prices, it'll change incentives, and you're away to the races. Other people will say, especially on the issue of climate change, that changing of relative prices through the tax system is necessary, but probably not sufficient. You may still need government involvement in encouraging technological development. That's a debate that I think is actually a fascinating debate. I'm not quite sure where I sit on that debate. And at some point, the Eco-Fiscal Commission might express a view on it, but we'll see. Here's an opportunity. Here is revenues. This is government revenues as a share of GDP, but these are revenues from environmentally related revenues. So, you know, energy taxes, fuel taxes, etc. Notice the numbers along the scale. These are, 1.52% of GDP. So Canada is here. So Canada is just over 1%. These other countries are considerably greater than Canada. There's a couple of different ways. They're 2%. U.S. is 0.7%. So there's a couple of different ways you can look at this. You can look at this chart and say, well, Canada has got an opportunity in the sense that it could catch up to these other 5 countries by doubling the share of our revenues that come from environmentally related taxes. But also, another way to think about this is that all of these countries are massively behind where they could be, and there's a massive opportunity for all of these countries. All of these countries are collecting 30, 35, 40, 45% of GDP in revenues. Whether you're a big government country or a small government country, you're collecting between 30 and 45 or 50% of GDP in revenues. Just think about the opportunity that you could actually massively lower your most growth-retarding taxes ever invented by man, which are corporate income taxes and personal income taxes. You could replace those with environmentally related taxes. Leave your total tax take unchanged, but just do a tax swap. So there's a huge opportunity there. Okay, so Eco-Fiscal Policy 101, I'm rather a fan of Economics 101. I teach Economics 101. I have a textbook for Economics 101. I actually think if all of the world understood Economics 101, it would just be a much, much better world. And I think when you can boil things down to Economics 101, that's a good thing. And I think almost anything can be boiled down to Economics 101. So here is Eco-Fiscal Policy 101. There's two parts to this. Part one is price pollution. Okay, so you could be talking about water pollution, air pollution. You could talk about road, driving pollution, congestion. You could be talking about carbon emissions. But two things are going to happen from pricing pollution. One is that you're going to change relative prices and create incentives to pollute less. That's, in my textbook, that's chapter 17. Okay? And you will actually produce incentives for innovation. So as firms or households are confronted with relative prices that penalize effectively pollution, they are going to be led to either adopt technologies or develop technologies to avoid polluting. So there's going to be an environmental benefit and there's going to be an innovation benefit. And that innovation in the long run is going to help our living standards. So here is a graph from our first paper, one of my favorites. This is actually from the Canadian Council of Academies. It's water pricing, so a bunch of countries. Water pricing is the orange, so per cubic meter. So here's high prices, low prices. Canada, very low price per water. Consumption is blue, which is in liters per day per person. Canada rather consumes a lot, and Germany rather consumes a little. So you look at that. Now, you look at that any way you like. And I'm not going to claim that there's causality. This is just a good old correlation. But there's an awfully sensible Economics 101 story behind this correlation. It is remarkable that countries, or maybe it's not remarkable at all, countries that pay a lot for water actually consume not very much. And countries that don't pay much for water consume it like crazy. So this is no suggestion here about what's the optimal price, just the idea that pricing matters, incentives matter. Okay, part two of eco-fiscal policy is take the revenues and recycle them. By the way, I would say that very often the debate in Canada, especially when it talks about carbon, the debate stops at part one. Okay? So there will be a lot of discussion about why a carbon price or a carbon tax or a cap and trade system is going to create problems. But very seldom they talk about this. Well, if you're going to collect a bunch of revenues from your pollution pricing, what are you going to do with your revenues? So a big part of what we are talking about in the Eco-Fiscal Commission is that this is a crucial part. Recycling the revenues. And there's a bunch of different ways you can recycle the revenues, but they're going to generate economic benefits if you do it sensibly. So, and different governments confronting different problems, different priorities, are probably going to choose different ways to recycle. So you could use those revenues to recycle corporate income tax, which I think there's still a tremendous amount of evidence across Canada and across the world, OECD, IMF, etc., that corporate income taxes are the most growth retarding taxes we've got. But you could reduce personal income taxes. You could use it to support government support or financial support of research and development or innovation. You could, in Canada, you could give it back through a low-income tax credit, something like a low-income GST tax credit, if you wanted to worry about the higher-priced activities on low-income households. Governments could mix and match. Choose a portfolio of these things. But how you recycle the revenues is going to determine the nature of the benefits you get from doing that. So there's lots of examples of this. Canada is actually quite behind the curve in terms of using these policies. And one of the things we talk about in our report is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel in the Eco-Fiscal Commission. This is not a new idea. This is actually quite an old idea, and it's actually used in many places. So Singapore, for example, introduced water pricing to conserve water. They import their water by pipeline from Malaysia, and they basically don't have any domestic water. So water pricing and water conservation were very important. They were worried about low-income households. So they actually used a chunk of their revenue, not all, but a big chunk of their revenue, to actually protect low-income households. So they were very worried about that particular problem. They used that method of recycling, and the policy has reduced water consumption pretty significantly and protected those low-income households. London in the UK has introduced road pricing over the past 10 years or so in a high congestion zone in the center of the city that has actually had quite a dramatic effect on reducing traffic there. Waste pricing in the UK. Waste pricing in the UK was actually a combination of a waste tax and a cap and trade system on different parts of the market, but it has ended up reducing waste and reducing landfill use significantly. Denmark introduced carbon pricing as part of a general tax reform, doing exactly what we just talked about in the previous slide. They introduced carbon taxation over time and then used those revenues to reduce other taxes. So theirs was part of a larger package of tax reform. BC, of course, British Columbia, did the same thing in 2008. They introduced they introduced a carbon tax that was legislated to be promised through legislation to be revenue neutral, and every dollar that they have earned in the carbon tax, which is now at $30 a ton in BC, has been returned, and then some, through corporate personal income tax deductions, plus some for low-income households. So lots of examples of these eco-fiscal policies being used and working in the rest of the world. Here's a couple of graphs straight out of the paper on carbon. The Eco-Fiscal Commission, I should say, is talking about all types of pollution, not just carbon, but it doesn't take very long whenever I start talking about eco-fiscal for somebody to jump to carbon. Carbon is obviously the big enchilada, and it's clearly what the press wants to talk about whenever they talk to me. The discussion goes very, very quickly to carbon, and I always try to work hard to come back and talk about things like residential garbage, and which just aren't as sexy, as it turns out, as carbon, but very important in our local lives. I come from Beaconsfield in Montreal, in the West Island of Montreal, which apparently is the second highest per capita garbage producer in the province. Who knew? Okay, so I've got to finish soon. This is a graph showing the effect of, this comes from a simulation, from an econometric model estimated on these countries, their eco-fiscal policies applied to carbon emissions, showing the percentage reduction over about 20 years, the percentage reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Not huge as a result of the policy. Not huge, but every little bit counts. These two graphs show the same thing, the effect of those policies, the change in GDP, and the change in employment. The big message here is, let's go back one. So emissions went down, even not hugely, emissions went down, but in these same set of countries, GDP actually went up, not very much, but GDP went up, and employment went up, except in the UK that it was flat. So you look at this and you say, maybe it's possible. Maybe it's possible that we can actually introduce an eco-fiscal policy, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it actually leaves the economy either alone or slightly better, which is the essence of recycling those revenues in a smart way. Lots of opportunities in Canada. Road congestion is becoming a it is a big issue in big cities. Municipal user fees, so cities that have crumbling water infrastructure, for example, and they need to actually raise revenues in a sensible way to finance rebuild of that infrastructure. Very often in Canada, we don't actually charge for water by the use. Okay, some communities do and a lot don't. We've got a lot of both inefficient and very expensive subsidies. This is where some of the environmentalists probably won't like what we have to say. if we actually analyze and advocate the elimination of very expensive and ineffective subsidies, even though they're green subsidies. But we have a few of these in this country. Carbon pricing, of course, air pollution pricing, water pricing, residential garbage, et cetera, et cetera. You look at that list and you maybe understand why we are aiming our attention at provincial governments and municipal governments. There's only one thing on this list, frankly, that the feds have much to say about, and that's carbon pricing. Everything else there is a provincial issue or a local issue. That's where the rubber hits the road on this issue. The rubber hits the road in the provinces and in the cities. And even, the feds and provinces have a shared jurisdiction on the environment, which means provinces have as much responsibility on carbon as the feds. I'll come back to that. So 3 tough issues that need to be addressed, and we will address them in every one of our reports. How do you do this in a way that protects low-income families? How do you do this in a way that deals with the competitiveness of firms and leakage? So here the issue is, if some Canadian jurisdiction, BC, Quebec, whatever, introduces policies like this, but neighboring jurisdictions do not, then are we simply going to have firms pick up and leave our jurisdiction, move across the border to that jurisdiction? We lose the economic benefits of their location, but global pollution is unchanged. That's a real problem, okay? So we have to deal with that. But one of the things that we are learning as we go through this is that this is a problem, but it's not a problem for every firm. It's not a problem for every firm in every sector in every province. There are some firms in some sectors for which this is a problem. But there are many firms and sectors where this is just not an issue. And the recycling of revenues. We have to talk about how those revenues are going to be recycled and efficient ways to do that. So those are the kinds of issues that we will address in every one of our reports. So what is the Commission itself? And I'll end with just a couple of slides here. It's a group of 12 economists. They are completely independent. 14 to 16 advisors who are whose pictures you will recognize in a moment. We're calling this a transpartisan advisory board. They are from across the political spectrum, from business, from civil society. We're going to be here for 6 years. We've already had 1. So 5 more years. Our plan is to issue a report roughly every 4 months. And we are very much national in scope, but regional in details. As I said, our focus is going to be on policies for provinces and cities, which forces us to get out to provinces and cities and talk to policymakers there about what problems they are facing and how we would design these policies sensibly given their local and provincial context. There is the Commission. I won't go through all of that. Well, I'll just tell you very quickly. There's me, there's Elizabeth Beale from Halifax, Paul Booth, who used to be Federal Deputy Minister of Environment, now at Western University, Mel Cap, who used to be Clerk of the Privy Council, now at U of T Policy School, Bev Dalby, Tax Specialist from University of Calgary, Don Drummond with a larger picture, because he's a larger guy. Don Drummond, who you've all heard of, Stuart Elgee from University of Ottawa, runs Sustainable Prosperity, Glenn Hodgson, Chief Economist of the Conference Board, Paul Lanois from HSA, environmental economist, Dick Lipsey, the Dean of Canadian Economics at SFU, retired, Nancy Ohlweiler from SFU, the most energetic person I've ever met, and France Saint-Hilaire from IRPP. So those are the commissioners. So my job is basically to keep them in line. We just actually had a conference call a couple of days ago to put our finishing touches on our second report, and keeping all these guys, herding all these cats is actually kind of fun. Here's our advisory board. Dominic Barton, the global head of McKinsey. Jean Charest, you know Jim Dinning is the best premier Alberta never had. And never will have now, unfortunately. So he was a treasurer under Ralph Klein. Mike Harcourt, former mayor of Vancouver and former premier of BC. Bruce Laurie, head of the Ivy Foundation, one of our funders. Janice McKinnon, Saskatchewan finance minister, former. Preston Manning, you recognize. Jack Mintz, you probably recognize. Peter Robinson, head of the Suzuki Foundation. Bob Ray, well-known face. Lauren Trottier, who's a Montreal big businessman and McGill benefactor. Sheila Watt-Cloutier. Steve Williams, head of Suncor. Paul Martin, I think you've probably heard of him. So that's our advisory board. So what's coming? This is my second to last slide. What's coming? Our next report is going to be in early April. So I'm not going to tell you too much because I don't want to scoop myself. But look for us in early April. The topic will be something juicy. I promise it will be a juicy topic. It's a controversial topic. It is a big topic. I've mentioned it a few times already. And I will tell you this. We found it very difficult to think about other topics before we had actually carved out our position on the big enchilada topic, which is carbon. That being said, I can't tell you what the topic is. And our approach is going to be truly Canadian. And I do mean that. It is a truly Canadian approach, which you will understand when you see it. Yet it is still going to be surprising. We will raise eyebrows and we will piss some people off. But our approach will be truly Canadian, still surprising, and eminently sensible. Because that's just who we are. So, please check out the website, co-fiscal.ca. There's lots of good stuff. And let me just end on one thing. This has been, I'm an academic economist. I'm an academic, right? I'm kind of like a normal academic. And this exercise is really not very academic in the sense that, what academics do is we write a paper, we have a good idea, or we think it's a good idea, so we write it down once, and then we send it off to some place, and then we think the world will notice, and then we go on to write another good idea, right? And it's just shockingly wrong, right? The world just doesn't notice when you write something once. So this exercise has been and is going to be at least as much about communications as it is about writing the actual report. So there's two parts to every process. We go through this, a long process talking with each other as commissioners about what this report is going to look like and what are the details and how do we get it right. And then there's the communications part. Our report that's going to come out in April will be absolutely finalized within about 10 days from today, maybe a week. And then it goes on to its second life, because then it becomes a communications product. And if you look on our website, I think you will be impressed. The communications people we've hired, it has just been an absolute shocker for me that there is communications people and what they do and how they do it and the way they think and the kind of ideas they come up with. It's just amazing. So you'll see lots of their work there. So I hope you like it. And if you've got any comments, send us comments. There's ways that you can send us stuff. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Merci, Chris. So thank you for what you are doing and the courage you have to address this tricky and controversial issue from Ottawa perspective, at least.
It's the beauty of having tenure.
And yeah, I remember a good time with you. Okay, so my point is when you see what's going on and the Obama. If you check the State of the Union address, they have more or less not very interested about Keystone, and Obama, it's more in the legacy mode because it's the last mandate. And the Canadian prosperity model was about oil sands, energy, and now we see what's going on. So conservative government has been very reluctant to go with the carbon tax or whatsoever, and but when I see what's going on, the climate change, the Paris meeting is coming. So what do you believe early on from Politics 101, our reality is that at some point Canada will catch up and do something about climate change, and I'm sure that your work will have a huge influence on the Canadians that we have to do something. But how realistic will be, from your point of view, that Canada finally try to do something? Quebec lead on that issue, like California. Ontario, maybe if you have any clue, if Ontario will join California and Quebec, and finally from coast to coast. That, from my point of view, more a bottom-up process than really a top-down from Ottawa. What is your view on that?
Good questions. So a couple of comments, and I'll try to keep these quick. Number one, people who are good at Economics 101 almost certainly fail Poly 101. So I'm not an expert in Political Science 101, but I'll give you my best. On things like Keystone, I actually think that if Canada, and I don't mean the federal government, I just mean Canada, if Canada had a better record or a better reputation, was better perceptions as being an environmental leader, I think Keystone would have been built. Okay? I mean, that's certainly debatable. I don't think it's a slam dunk. But I think the social license that Keystone is looking for is absent, partly because we are perceived as being an environmental laggard. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think it's really important to understand that and I will write a column at some point in the next few weeks, so look for it, and it'll be making this point, that you can believe in a carbon price and design a carbon price, and it can be an effective carbon price, and you can still have a very healthy oil and gas sector. There's no inconsistency about that, none. And I think that is not generally understood. I think people tend to believe that, hold on, how can you possibly price carbon? And that must imply shutting down Alberta. Well, I just think that's false, completely false. So that's the second thing. Third thing is, I don't think the feds are the only people that can act here. In fact, as you said, I mean, Quebec is already engaged in a cap and trade system with Washington, with California. Ontario is making noises, very clear noises about doing something. Alberta is making noises about redesigning their existing system. BC has already introduced a very effective system. Just imagine if Ontario whatever Ontario is going to do, if they actually do something in the next year, I think the momentum completely changes in this country. And I think actually there will be a great deal of sense in the provinces acting and following the lead of other provinces. So I actually think a bottom-up strategy is a truly Canadian thing. Actually, there's a lot of things in this country that are done from the provinces up. And some of them are done only from the provinces. So I think this is one where that kind of approach may make perfect sense. And today Justin Trudeau said, or yesterday Justin Trudeau said, he actually thinks the provinces is the place to do this. So there you go. And I find it hard to believe that the current Conservative government would disagree with that. This is a Conservative government that respects provincial action, or at least their ability to act. Anything else?
Yes, I've got one question. When you were talking about recycling fiscally, are you talking about different or more tariff, or are you really talking about income tax for personal and company-wise?
I think my answer is we're talking about a bunch of different ways to recycle revenues. Some of them would absolutely be tax cuts. Some of them would be spending. But so this is then what we will talk about, and we talk about this in our first paper, we talk about the kinds of benefits you get from different recycling options. And I think what you will see in every one of our reports is some discussion about those recycling options and the relative benefits you'll get from them. So we're not going to take a position generally that says you should recycle this way but not this way. What I think we will do is say these are 4 obvious choices and here are the pros and cons of each one. And we fully expect that different governments in different situations would choose different ones. Okay?
Hi, I'd like to know if you ever heard of the cradle-to-cradle buzz or the cradle-to-cradle initiative, because it's starting to be quite big in many countries, but I'm not sure that in Canada we quite heard about it or did something about it in any way.
A cradle-to-cradle?
Yep. It's really interesting in an economic point of view, and it's quite different, but it's introduced.
Cradle-to-cradle or cradle-to-grave?
Cradle-to-cradle. Well, it means, that anything we build or make, usually a cycle, yeah.
Gotcha. So this is talking about the life cycle of the products and thinking about the environmental footprint of a product over its entire life cycle. So this gets into issues, for example, about product design, about landfill use. So I think this is something that I'll just make a prediction that this will come up in our reports, okay? Because if you start pricing the major types of pollution, and you're never going to price them all, but if you start pricing the major types of pollution, then the life cycle environmental footprint instantly of most products instantly becomes something worth adjusting.